In the late summer of 1938, a strange silhouette appeared on dealer lots across the American Midwest. A machine that looked less like a tool of the harvest and more like an armored chariot of the future. Bathed in a brilliant hue known as prairie gold, the Minneapolis-Moline UDLX comfort tractor possessed a fully enclosed steel cab. It was outfitted with an electric starter, safety glass, a passenger seat, a heater, and a dashboard radio. It could surge to 40 miles per hour on rural asphalt, engineered to carry a man directly from the furrows of a muddy field to the center of a town square. Priced at $2,155, roughly $46,000 today, it demanded nearly double the cost of a standard open-air machine. Its creators believed they had conquered the elements, forging a fortress against the freezing gales of a Dakota winter and the suffocating dust of a Kansas drought. The American farmer stared at this golden vision, scoffed, and refused to open his wallet. In an era still bruised by the Great Depression, the men who worked the soil viewed the radio and heater not as salvation, but as an expensive, almost comical vanity. Dealers were paralyzed with unsold inventory. In quiet desperation, some local mechanics literally unbolted the magnificent steel cabs, stripping the vision away just to sell the raw chassis beneath. 3 decades later, the enclosed cab would become the undisputed standard of modern agriculture. But the true American saga of Minneapolis-Moline is not merely the fable of a machine born 30 years too soon. It is an epic of fierce industrial ambition, where independent mechanical mastery ultimately met the cold, crushing gravity of corporate consolidation. Somewhere in a barn, in a rural museum, or in an aging mechanic's toolbox, there is a builder's plate with a vanished name and a profound American story behind it. We tell those stories. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story of Minneapolis-Moline begins not in a modern corporate boardroom, but in the industrial heart of the Midwest in 1929. Before a single drop of prairie gold paint ever touched a factory floor, the American agricultural market was a brutal arena divided by extremes. In the 1920s, as the nation's farms slowly transitioned from draft horses to mechanical horsepower, a massive gap existed in the fields of the Midwest and the Great Plains. American farmers were forced to choose between two imperfect compromises. On one side were the massive, lumbering prairie tractors, iron behemoths weighing upwards of 10,000 pounds that compacted the soil, consumed oceans of fuel, and required a small crew just to operate. On the other side were the new, lightweight row crop tractors, nimble machines designed to cultivate corn, but which simply spun their steel wheels helplessly when hitched to a heavy plow in hardened Dakota clay. The American farmer lacked a middle ground. There was no mid-sized, aggressively over-engineered machine that possessed the structural integrity of a railroad locomotive, but was scaled for a family operation. In March 1929, 3 established regional manufacturers looked at the consolidating power of industry giants like International Harvester and John Deere, and realized they could not survive alone. They operated in different cities, but they shared a philosophy of heavy iron. The first was the Minneapolis Steel and Machinery Company, based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. They were fabricators of structural steel, bridge components, and the legendary Twin City tractors, machines renowned for their indestructible engine blocks. The second was the Minneapolis Threshing Machine Company, located just down the road in Hopkins, Minnesota. They dominated the harvest market with massive threshers, stationary, belt-driven machines that violently separated grain from stalks before the invention of the modern combine. The third was the Moline Plow Company of Moline, Illinois, a firm with a century of expertise in forging steel implements that actually cut the earth. Individually, they were respected craftsmen, but to compete against full-line corporate giants, they needed to offer a farmer everything from the engine that pulled the plow to the plow itself. They merged. They formed the Minneapolis-Moline Power Implement Company. The timing was catastrophic. 7 months after the ink dried on the merger, the stock market collapsed in October 1929. The Great Depression settled over the American farm like a suffocating blanket. Commodity prices plummeted. Foreclosures swept across the Midwest. Farmers were not buying new machinery. They were struggling to keep their land. The newly formed Minneapolis-Moline stepped directly into the worst economic crisis in American history. They survived not through aggressive marketing, but through an obsessive, almost stubborn commitment to raw engineering. Instead of cheapening their tractors to cut costs, Minneapolis-Moline engineers doubled down on the Twin City heritage. They poured thick, heavy engine blocks. They utilized cross-mounted engines, a design architecture where the engine block sits horizontally across the tractor frame rather than longitudinally. This layout allowed power to transfer directly to the transmission with fewer bevel gears. Fewer gears meant less power lost to internal friction. It meant pure, unadulterated torque. Torque, the raw twisting force that determines whether a tractor stalls or pulls through a tough patch of soil, was their religion. In the heavy, waterlogged clay of the Red River Valley, stretching across Minnesota and North Dakota, a tractor did not just pull an implement, it fought the earth. Pulling a moldboard plow, an implement with curved steel blades that cuts deep into the ground and violently turns over the top layer of soil, required immense, sustained lugging power. While competitor engines screamed at high speeds to generate horsepower, Minneapolis-Moline engines were designed to run at barely 1,000 revolutions per minute. They produced a steady, rhythmic thumping, delivering maximum pulling force at a walking pace without ever overheating. In 1932, an American farmer could purchase a Minneapolis-Moline Twin City KT tractor for approximately $1,050, roughly $23,000 today. In the depths of the Depression, this was a staggering capital investment. Yet the newly consolidated dealer network, initially prioritizing just 12 states across the Corn Belt and the Great Plains, managed to move inventory by pitching absolute mechanical certainty. Trade journals of the era, such as Implement and Tractor, consistently noted the excessive thickness of the castings and the massive dimensions of their crankshafts compared to domestic rivals. While other companies sold tens of thousands of lighter, cheaper units, historical records indicate Minneapolis-Moline held its ground by selling strictly to the heavy acreage operators who could not afford a catastrophic breakdown during the narrow planting window. By the late 1930s, as the economy stabilized and the dust storms began to clear, the company realized it needed a unified visual identity. The old, mismatched fleet of battleship grays and dark greens inherited from the 1929 merger was retired. They coated their massive castings in a bright, unapologetic yellow-orange. They called it Prairie Gold. It was not a subtle color. It was designed to be seen through a cloud of harvest dust from a mile across a Kansas wheat field. The paint announced that a massive, overbuilt engine was doing the heavy work. The company had survived its brutal birth. Now it needed an innovation that would turn its heavy iron into an empire. Following the conclusion of the Second World War, the American agricultural landscape transformed completely. Draft horses were largely banished to history. Millions of soldiers returned home. Domestic manufacturing shifted from tanks back to plows, and the size of the average family farm began to expand. But as acreage grew, so did the brutal arithmetic of operating costs. Pulling wider plows required larger engines. Larger engines consumed oceans of gasoline. In a commodity market where the price of a bushel of wheat was never guaranteed, fuel and maintenance expenses dictated the difference between a profitable harvest and foreclosure. Competitors like International Harvester and John Deere experimented with early, temperamental diesel engines, or continued to rely on low-compression gasoline designs. Minneapolis-Moline, leaning on its heritage of heavy iron, took a completely different, distinctly American path. They looked toward the booming oil refineries of the Southwest and they found their American moat. In the late 1940s, Minneapolis-Moline introduced the first factory-engineered, high-production tractors powered by liquid petroleum gas, LP gas. A highly compressed, refined mixture of propane and butane, was a cheap, abundant byproduct of the American petroleum industry. Previously, refineries had simply burned it off as waste. When a farmer walked onto a dealer lot in 1949 and looked at an LP-powered Minneapolis-Moline Model U, the physical difference was immediately striking. Gone was the traditional, slender, sheet metal fuel tank bridging the steering wheel and the radiator. In its place sat a massive, heavy-gauge steel cylinder, bolted securely over the cross-mounted Twin City engine block. The machine looked like a yellow locomotive carrying a pressurized bomb. To the untrained eye, it appeared dangerous. To an agricultural economist, it looked like financial salvation. The technical advantage of LP gas rested in how the fuel entered the engine. Standard gasoline enters a combustion chamber as a wet mist. That wet fuel washes the lubricating oil off the cylinder walls, increasing friction, and it leaves behind a heavy residue of carbon soot that eventually chokes the valves. LP gas, however, is stored under immense pressure as a liquid, but vaporizes the instant it is released. It enters the combustion chamber as a completely dry gas. Because the fuel was dry, it did not strip the oil. Because it burned perfectly clean, there was no carbon buildup, no fouled spark plugs, no diluted crankcase oil. An engine-burning gasoline might require a complete oil change every 100 operating hours. A Minneapolis-Moline burning factory-engineered LP gas could easily run for 1,000 hours before the oil lost its lubricating properties. In the grueling schedule of the American harvest, where a tractor ran continuously from dawn until midnight, eliminating engine wear was just as valuable as raw horsepower. Furthermore, LP gas possessed a naturally high octane rating, allowing Minneapolis-Moline engineers to radically alter the internal geometry of the engine. They installed high-compression heads, cylinder caps that squeeze the fuel and air mixture into a much tighter, more volatile space before the spark plug fires. They also utilized cold manifolds, intake pipes that purposefully avoid the heat of the exhaust system, keeping the incoming fuel-air mixture dense and packed with explosive energy. Other companies offered aftermarket kits to convert gasoline tractors to propane, but these were crude compromises. By casting engines specifically to handle the immense internal pressures of LP gas straight from the factory floor, Minneapolis-Moline delivered power that the competition simply could not match without catastrophic engine failure. In 1951, an LP-powered Minneapolis-Moline Model U retailed for approximately $2,400, roughly $29,000 today. The purchase price was entirely comparable to gasoline-powered rivals from John Deere or Case, but the operating economics were devastating to the competition. In the American Southwest, rural fuel cooperatives and local distributors were practically giving the fuel away. While regular agricultural gasoline cost roughly 19 cents a gallon, LP gas could be delivered directly to a farm's bulk tank for 8 to 10 cents a gallon. For a farmer working 800 acres, the fuel savings alone could pay for the entire tractor within 3 seasons. This mechanical breakthrough violently realigned the brand's distribution geography. Minneapolis-Moline ceased being just a regional player in the upper Midwest and exploded across the American South and West. In the Texas High Plains, where vast stretches of cotton relied on deep well irrigation, farmers needed stationary engines that could run unattended for weeks. MMM sold their LP tractor engines as standalone power units, cementing their reputation for invincibility. In the Oklahoma Cotton Belt, dealers could not stock the LP models fast enough. In the vast, intensely irrigated stretches of California's Central Valley, large-scale vegetable growers purchased fleets of the Golden machines, prizing the clean exhaust that did not settle toxic soot onto high-value crops. The turning point of institutional validation occurred in the summer of 1951 at the Nebraska Tractor Test Laboratory, the ultimate federally recognized independent proving ground that measured the actual drawbar and belt horsepower of agricultural machines. When state engineers attached the Minneapolis-Moline Model U to the testing dynamometer, the results shocked the industry. The tractor produced nearly 40 belt horsepower while demonstrating fuel efficiency curves and thermal stability that shattered previous records for its weight class. The name on the side of the hood was no longer just a regional survivor of a Depression-era merger. It was a specification. By perfectly aligning their heavy-duty engineering heritage with a cheap, uniquely American fuel source, Minneapolis-Moline forged a loyal ecosystem of regional distributors, rural fuel co-ops, and heavy acreage farmers. They had bypassed the diesel wars entirely, choosing instead to dominate the propane market. As the 1950s dawned, the company prepared to scale its operations to unprecedented heights, building machines so large they would permanently alter the horizon of the Great Plains. By the mid-1950s, the American agricultural horizon was painted in prairie gold. Minneapolis-Moline had transformed from a desperate Depression-era merger into a heavy iron titan of the Midwest. The company operated two sprawling manufacturing complexes in Minnesota: the historic Lake Street plant in the heart of Minneapolis, which forged the indestructible Twin City engine blocks, and the enormous Hopkins Works just miles away where harvesters and implements were assembled by thousands of union workers. The rhythm of the factory floors in Minnesota matched the rhythm of the harvest. During the peak production years, trainloads of raw iron ore arrived daily at the Lake Street foundries. The heat was blinding. The noise was deafening. Generations of Minneapolis machinists spent their entire working lives milling engine heads to precise tolerances, knowing that a single flaw could cost a distant farmer his livelihood. They were not building disposable consumer goods. They were casting capital assets. At its zenith, the Minneapolis-Moline distribution network commanded over 2,000 independent dealerships stretching across the North American continent. They were anchored in the deep, black soil of the Corn Belt, but their true kingdom lay further west and south. The dealership signs glowing in the Texas Panhandle, the local parts counters in the Kansas Wheat Belt, the rural fuel cooperatives of Oklahoma, and the heavy acreage implement lots of South Dakota all depended on a single, unwavering promise: raw, unyielding torque. As American farms consolidated and the push for maximum yield accelerated, implements grew drastically wider. Moldboard plows expanded from 2 bottoms to 4, and then to 6. Slicing 6 heavy steel blades through hardened prairie clay required a tractor of immense structural weight. If a tractor was too light, its wheels spun uselessly, burning expensive rubber against the earth. If its engine lacked low-end lugging power, it would violently stall when the plow struck a compacted root system. On a dry, windswept afternoon in western Kansas, where a hardened plow pan threatened to snap lesser machinery, the low RPM torque of a heavy cast engine could mean the difference between turning the soil before the winter freeze and losing a critical week of field preparation. Minneapolis-Moline answered this demand by scaling their engineering philosophy to its absolute physical limit. They introduced the mighty G-Series. When a farmer stood beside a Minneapolis-Moline G6, introduced in 1959, he was not looking at a nimble utility tractor designed for light chores. He was looking at nearly 8,000 pounds of cast iron and steel, powered by a massive 425 cubic inch LP gas or diesel engine The G6 was built for the brutal, continuous labor of the Great Plains. It was a machine of uncompromising industrial presence. The engine block alone was so thick, so heavily cast, that it served as the structural backbone of the tractor, eliminating the need for a traditional steel frame. The axles were thick columns of forged steel. The transmission housed gears cut wide and deep, designed to absorb the punishing shock loads of heavy tillage without shattering. The G6 cost approximately $5,600 in 1959, roughly $60,000 today. It was an elite capital investment for a professional operator. At the Nebraska Tractor Test Laboratory, the proving ground for American farm horsepower, the G6 laid down numbers that cemented its legendary status. It delivered over 70 drawbar horsepower, pulling an astonishing 9,000 pounds of dead weight without hesitation. The trade journals of the era, from Implement and Tractor to Successful Farming, recognized Minneapolis-Moline not just as a tractor manufacturer, but as an industrial heavyweight. Dealerships sold the machines not through flashy marketing campaigns, but through brutal field demonstrations. A dealer would drive a G6 into an unworked field, drop a heavy disc harrow deep into the soil, and throttle the engine down to a crawl. Competitors' engines would cough, sputter, and die. The big Prairie Gold engine would simply lug, firing with the slow, rhythmic cadence of a stationary power plant, dragging the heavy steel through the earth as if the resistance did not exist. The cultural zenith of the Prairie Gold empire was not found in a corporate boardroom, but in the brutal, sprawling wheat fields of the American Great Plains during the late 1950s and early 1960s. Here, farms were no longer measured in hundreds of acres, but in thousands. As the autumn grain harvest concluded, the most punishing work of the agricultural calendar immediately began: fall tillage. In states like South Dakota and Kansas, the vast expanses of wheat stubble had to be broken and prepared for the next season before the ground froze solid. Time was the enemy. On a freezing South Dakota evening, where a sudden blizzard could bury an unworked field and suffocate next year's crop, the sheer mechanical endurance of a Minneapolis-Moline block meant the difference between surviving the winter with a prepared seedbed and facing financial ruin in the spring. To conquer this hardening landscape, farmers relied on implements like the chisel plow, a heavy tillage tool with deep, curved steel shanks that shatters compacted subsoil without turning over the top layer, crucial for retaining moisture in dry climates. Pulling a wide chisel plow through dry clay required unrelenting, low-end torque. Dealers across the wheat belt capitalized heavily on this physical reality. In local newspaper advertisements and at regional events like the Kansas State Fair, Minneapolis-Moline was not marketed as a general utility brand. It was sold strictly as an industrial workhorse. The network of 2,000 independent dealerships knew exactly who their customer was. They were not selling to the weekend hobbyist. They were selling to the custom harvesters in Oklahoma, the large-scale dryland wheat farmers in North Dakota, and the massive irrigation operators in the Texas Panhandle. The ultimate expression of this philosophy arrived in the mid-1960s with the introduction of the Minneapolis-Moline G1000. It was a mechanical leviathan, producing over 100 horsepower at the PTO, or power takeoff, the rotating rear shaft that transfers engine power to driven implements. The G1000 was available in factory-engineered LP gas or diesel configurations at roughly $8,500 in 1966, equivalent to nearly $80,000 today. It was a massive capital expenditure. But for the heavy acreage operator, it was an insurance policy cast in iron. The G1000 did not scream under load. It grunted, gripping the earth and pulling with a steady, locomotive-like rhythm that became the signature sound of the American harvest. By this era, the brand had reached its physical peak. peak dealership coverage spanning from the Corn Belt to the San Joaquin Valley, peak respect at the Nebraska Tractor Test Laboratory, peak presence in the pages of Farm Journal and Successful Farming. The Hopkins and Lake Street plants in Minnesota were operating at full capacity, employing thousands of machinists, assembly workers, and engineers. A farmer could buy a Minneapolis-Moline tractor, a Minneapolis-Moline planter, and a Minneapolis-Moline combine, entirely financing his operation through the company's trusted credit division. They poured the iron, they built the engines, they commanded the fields. But beneath the brilliant yellow paint and the flawless mechanical performance, a fatal structural vulnerability was taking hold. Tractor engineering was shifting from an exercise in raw iron casting to a war of corporate finance. Building engines with excessively thick walls, over-engineered gearboxes, and low RPM architecture was incredibly expensive. It required massive amounts of raw material and thousands of labor hours per unit. While domestic giants like John Deere and International Harvester were heavily investing in highly efficient, high-speed diesel engines and standardizing their global supply chains to drastically cut production costs, Minneapolis-Moline stubbornly adhered to their heavy iron heritage. They built tractors that lasted a lifetime, which meant a farmer did not need to buy a replacement 5 years later. The engineering was brilliant. The business model was bleeding. In the hyper-competitive American farm market, survival was no longer guaranteed by building the best machine. It was dictated by who had the deepest pockets, the most efficient factories, and the largest research budgets. The Prairie Gold tractors were winning the battle in the dirt, but the company that built them was quietly losing the war on the balance sheet. The collapse of the Minneapolis-Moline empire was not triggered by a sudden mechanical failure in the field. The heavy iron of the Prairie Gold tractors continued to perform exactly as advertised, pulling heavy implements through the dense clay of the Dakotas and powering irrigation pumps across the Texas Panhandle. Instead, the company was systematically dismantled by the brutal, structural forces of American corporate consolidation. The decline began not on the farm, but on the balance sheet. By the early 1960s, the American agricultural equipment industry was undergoing a massive, violent technological disruption. The era of pure, brute force cast iron was ending. A new generation of American farmers, managing larger acreages with thinner profit margins, demanded a different kind of mechanization. They did not just want low-end torque. They wanted sophisticated engineering. They required power-shift transmissions, complex gearboxes that allowed an operator to change speeds under heavy load without stopping or clutching. They needed closed-center hydraulics, advanced pressurized fluid systems that delivered instant responsive power to multiple massive implements simultaneously. They demanded factory-integrated climate-controlled cabs to survive 14-hour days in toxic chemical dust. Developing these technologies required staggering amounts of capital. Giant domestic competitors like John Deere and International Harvester were pouring millions of dollars into pure research and development. They were building entirely new engine architectures, modernizing their assembly lines, and leveraging their massive dominant dealer networks to push these advanced machines into every county in the Midwest. Minneapolis-Moline simply did not possess the financial scale to wage this war. Their greatest asset, the obsessive heavy iron engineering that produced the indestructible Twin City blocks, became their most fatal financial liability. Casting engine blocks so thick that they did not require a supporting frame was a magnificent engineering achievement, but it was an incredibly expensive way to manufacture a tractor. Every unit that rolled out of the Lake Street plant in Minneapolis contained thousands of pounds of high-grade raw material and required countless hours of specialized, unionized machining labor. As material costs rose and profit margins thinned, Minneapolis-Moline found itself trapped. They could not cheapen their tractors without destroying the legendary reliability their entire brand rested upon. but they could not maintain their heavy iron philosophy while keeping their prices competitive with mass-produced, high-speed diesel competitors. The company had exhausted its capital building the ultimate machines for the 1950s, leaving them desperately underfunded for the technological leaps of the 1960s. This financial vulnerability attracted the attention of a completely different kind of industrial predator. In 1963, the American agricultural landscape witnessed a corporate turning point that would ultimately erase the Prairie Gold name. The White Motor Company, a massive and highly profitable manufacturer of heavy-duty commercial trucks based in Cleveland, Ohio, decided to aggressively diversify its portfolio. White Motor Company did not share Minneapolis-Moline's localized, farm-centric heritage. They operated on the cold arithmetic of corporate conglomerates, acquire distressed legacy brands, consolidate their manufacturing, merge their engineering departments, and relentlessly extract shareholder value by eliminating redundancies. White Motor Company purchased Minneapolis-Moline. The independent heavy iron titan of the Midwest was instantly reduced to a subsidiary on a corporate ledger. Initially, the transition was subtle. White Motor Company retained the Prairie Gold paint, kept the Minneapolis plants running, and allowed the dealer network to continue selling the G-Series tractors. But the structural damage had been done. The autonomy was gone. The engineering decisions that had once been made by veteran tractor mechanics in Minnesota were now being dictated by corporate executives in Ohio who viewed tractors not as specialized agricultural tools, but as broad industrial commodities. The strategy of corporate consolidation accelerated rapidly. White Motor Company had already acquired the Oliver Corporation, another highly respected American tractor manufacturer known for its smooth, six-cylinder engines and green paint. A few years earlier, they had also purchased Cockshut, a major Canadian farm equipment brand. Instead of allowing these three distinct companies to compete and innovate naturally, White Motor executives forced them into an unnatural, hybridized marriage. The goal was cost reduction through shared parts. The result was engineering chaos and dealer network cannibalization. By the late 1960s, the distinct engineering DNA of Minneapolis-Moline began to dissolve. The legendary Lake Street foundries were ordered to cast parts for Oliver machines. Oliver factories were instructed to build components for Minneapolis-Moline. To save money on research and development, White Motor Company began cross-branding tractors. A farmer might walk into a loyal Minneapolis-Moline dealership in Kansas, looking for the heavy-lugging torque he had trusted for decades, only to find an Oliver tractor that had simply been painted Prairie Gold and slapped with decals. In the fiercely loyal, highly brand-conscious world of American agriculture, this was a catastrophic miscalculation. A tractor purchase was a generational commitment. Farmers noticed the different engine blocks. They noticed the altered transmission housings. They noticed that the heavy, indestructible castings of the old Twin City heritage were slowly being replaced by lighter, generic corporate components. The frustration bled directly into the dealer network. Minneapolis-Moline dealers, independent businessmen who had survived the Great Depression by promising their communities uncompromised reliability, suddenly found themselves forced to defend machines they did not recognize. Furthermore, in towns where both an Oliver dealer and a Minneapolis-Moline dealer operated, White Motor Company began forcing them to merge, directly pitting former local rivals against one another under the pressure of corporate sales quotas. The retreat had officially begun. In the pages of agricultural trade journals, the once dominant advertisements for the mighty G-Series were quietly replaced by confusing corporate marketing that tried to sell White, Oliver, and Minneapolis-Moline simultaneously. Longtime engineers at the Hopkins and Lake Street plants began to retire or leave in frustration as their heavy iron philosophy was overridden by cost-cutting mandates. The tractors were no longer being built to conquer the hardened clay of the Great Plains. They were being assembled to satisfy the quarterly earnings reports of a trucking conglomerate in Ohio. The prairie gold paint still covered the sheet metal, but the soul beneath the hood had been mortally wounded, setting the stage for the final, ruthless erasure of the brand. In a desperate bid to reclaim their heavy iron supremacy against the crushing weight of Force 4, technological disruption, Minneapolis-Moline engineers made one final, monumental push in 1969. They introduced the A4T-1600. It was an articulated four-wheel drive colossus, a machine that bent in the middle to steer, designed explicitly for the massive wheat acreages of Montana and the Dakotas. It was powered by a towering 504 cubic inch engine block, available in both factory LP gas and diesel, promising to pull implements wider than anything the company had ever built. But the corporate owners in Ohio refused to authorize the capital for a newly engineered, high-capacity transmission. Instead, the massive engine was mated to an older, two-wheel drive gearbox. The sheer torque of the 504 cubic inch block, combined with the unyielding grip of four massive drive tires, literally tore the internal transmission gears to pieces. Tractors broke in the middle of the field during crucial harvest windows. Warranty claims skyrocketed. Independent dealerships, already struggling under corporate sales quotas, were forced to absorb the financial and reputational damage of mechanical failures that corporate accountants had mathematically guaranteed. By the early 1970s, the brand was being quietly consumed by Force 3, competition from used equipment and domestic loyalty. The American farm equipment market ruthlessly punished the brand's compromised identity. An independent farmer in Iowa could purchase a 5-year-old, used John Deere or International Harvester with guaranteed parts availability from a stable local dealer. Alternatively, he could risk his harvest on a new Minneapolis-Moline that might contain Oliver parts, white components, and a corporate warranty of questionable value. Consequently, the resale value of Prairie Gold machines plummeted. This triggered Force 2, farm credit and capital headwinds. Banks and rural farm credit associations began viewing Minneapolis-Moline equipment not as a secure capital asset, but as a high-risk liability. Loan officers reduced the amount of money they would lend against new tractors, recognizing that the brand was losing its market stability. In the heavily leveraged world of American agriculture, if a tractor cannot be financed at a favorable rate, a tractor simply cannot be sold. The fatal blow, however, arrived not from a competitor in the field, but from the boardroom in Cleveland. By 1974, White Motor Company was suffocating under its own massive corporate debt, battered by inflation, rising material costs, and severe mismanagement across its heavy truck divisions. In a desperate attempt to streamline operations and appease nervous creditors, executives made a terminal calculation. They decided that maintaining 3 distinct agricultural identities, Oliver, Cockshut, and Minneapolis-Moline, was an inefficient, unnecessary expense. They issued the execution order. The historic brands were to be completely liquidated and merged into a single, generic corporate entity, White Farm Equipment. The erasure was immediate, physical, and profoundly brutal. The legendary Prairie Gold paint, the vibrant, unapologetic color that had signaled raw, unyielding torque across the Great Plains since the dark days of the Great Depression, was officially banned from the factory floor. It was replaced by a cold, uniform corporate silver. The Minneapolis-Moline decals were systematically scraped off the hoods of existing inventory. The iconic cast iron badges were removed from the grills. Farmers who had driven yellow tractors through 3 generations of family ownership, who had survived droughts and economic crashes relying on Twin City engine blocks, were suddenly told that their brand no longer existed. The name on the builder's plate was no longer a guarantee of specialized Minnesota craftsmanship. It was just a subsidiary label of a failing trucking conglomerate. The destruction of the brand required the total dismantling of its physical empire. The massive industrial complexes in Minnesota, once the beating heart of American heavy iron, were systematically decommissioned. The historic Lake Street plant in Minneapolis, where thousands of union machinists had poured the indestructible Twin City engine blocks for half a century, was shuttered. The sprawling Hopkins Assembly Works, which had built the giant harvesters that cleared the wheat belt, went completely silent. Machinery was auctioned off. Proprietary tooling was scrapped. Decades of specialized, localized mechanical knowledge were permanently scattered across the Midwest as engineers, foundry workers, and assemblymen were unceremoniously handed termination notices. The industrial ecosystem that had built the heavy iron empire was ripped apart, sold off piece by piece to satisfy corporate debt. Out in the countryside, the dealer network collapsed. Independent businessmen who had built their entire livelihoods around the Prairie Gold sign were ordered to take those signs down. They were told to sell silver tractors built on corporate compromises. Many refused. Dealerships that had anchored rural towns in South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas simply closed their doors. Others defected, switching their loyalty to domestic rivals who still respected the specific needs of the American farmer. The retreat from the American farm was absolute. The corporate silver machines failed to capture the fierce loyalty of the heavy acreage operators. The parts supply chains fractured. The service manuals became obsolete. The signs came down. The independent mechanics walked away. The Lake Street foundries cooled. The Hopkins lines stopped. The corporate ledgers closed. The heavy iron died. The fields went quiet. In the silence that followed the erasure of the Prairie Gold name, the physical reality of Minneapolis-Moline did not simply vanish. It retreated into the hands of the very people who had once relied on it. There was no American corporate resurrection. White Farm Equipment, the conglomerate that had systematically dismantled the empire to pay off its mounting debts, eventually collapsed under the weight of the 1980s farm crisis, taking the Oliver and White brand names into oblivion with it. Some industrial legacies do not survive the American market. The silence is the story. Yet, in the decades since the last tractor left the assembly lines in Hopkins, a fierce, decentralized preservation community has emerged. Today, the secondary market for surviving Minneapolis-Moline tractors is defined by a dedicated network of collectors, restorers, and practical operators who view these machines not as museum relics, but as functional partners. Across the American Midwest, state fairs and county tractor pulls remain the primary arena for the brand's afterlife. At an antique tractor pull in Iowa or a regional show in Nebraska, it is not uncommon to see a restored G1000 or a vintage U-Series still dominating the sled. Collectors pay thousands for original, high-grade examples, but the machines are rarely displayed behind velvet ropes. They are maintained by family farms, retired mechanics, and hobbyists who appreciate the raw, over-engineered structural integrity that define the brand. Why does the original still matter in an age of GPS-guided precision and integrated software? For a family farm, a simple, heavy-cast diesel or LP-powered tractor, properly maintained, remains a functional necessity. It does not require a proprietary computer interface, emission-compliant sensors, or a six-figure debt load to operate. It possesses a mechanical simplicity that permits a farmer to repair a broken linkage with basic hand tools in a shed, rather than waiting days for a specialized technician to arrive with a diagnostic laptop. For certain tasks, raking hay, running an auger, pulling a grain wagon, or clearing heavy snow, the mechanical reliability of the Prairie Gold era remains unmatched by modern production standards. The physical landscape of the Minneapolis-Moline story tells a quieter, more somber history. The Lake Street plant in Minneapolis, once a roaring foundry that forged the heart of the Twin City engines, stands today as a reimagined urban space, its industrial soul repurposed for modern commerce. The sprawling complex in Hopkins, where thousands of workers once assembled the machinery that harvested the American Great Plains, has been largely cleared, its footprint replaced by the mundane suburban development of a city that has moved on. The agricultural landscape itself has transformed. The smaller, diverse operations that Minneapolis-Moline was built to serve have largely consolidated into massive corporate-owned holdings. The machinery that once balanced the independence of a family farmer against the unforgiving clay of the Midwest has become a historical marker of a different agricultural era. One surprising footnote remains: the engine architecture of the Minneapolis-Moline machines, particularly their advanced work with LP gas and low RPM lugging power, subtly influenced the design parameters for heavy-duty stationary engines and specialized irrigation power units long after the company died. The obsession with maximum torque at walking speed was not just a branding exercise, it was a foundational engineering lesson in how to harness raw mechanical force. What does the American story of Minneapolis-Moline reveal about our commercial culture? It demonstrates that the United States is structurally built to absorb, exhaust, and ultimately discard foreign or independent excellence if it cannot conform to the relentless demand for corporate scale, standardized service networks, and low-cost manufacturing. The gap between what a farmer says he values, engineering, craftsmanship, reliability, and what the market actually forces him to prioritize, parts availability, financing, service speed, and resale value, is a canyon that few independent manufacturers can successfully bridge. When a farm culture built on the virtues of repair and mechanical longevity is replaced by a system driven by short-term financing and rapid obsolescence, the loss is not just measured in horsepower. It is measured in the erosion of a localized, self-sufficient way of working the earth. The story of the Prairie Gold tractors is not merely a tale of a vanished company. It is a mirror held up to the evolution of American industry itself. Deep in a Minnesota shed, a G1000 sits quietly on a dirt floor, its faded yellow hood scarred by decades of harvest dust and heavy steel implements. It is still waiting for a hand on the throttle, a turn of the starter, and a field that needs turning before the ground freezes solid. See you in the next video.